All right, wonderful people. Today we are going to be jumping into our fourth of six video lectures on our skeletal system. Today we're going to be tackling standard 4, which is going to focus on our axial skeleton. Now, I love this section of the unit. These next two standards are going to be our axial and then our appendicular bones. And so before we really get into anything too serious and really start going over the nitty-gritty of the axial skeleton, I want you guys to try your best, and you'll see this on the first page of your note sheets, to label this skeleton that you see to my side here. You don't have to know it all. Take your best guess at some of it. The real thing here is I want to see how much you know going in, because I think a lot of you guys will be surprised by the amount that you know. And so as we go, kind of use this image as your template of what, at the very minimum, I need to know, right? Make sure that you can label the bones on this guy and understand that this is kind of the bare minimum, and we are going to go much more in depth as we continue through here. So today we are going to be talking about our axial skeleton. We talked about what that meant in the first standard, but a quick little refresher. Axial is our axis. It is the part of our skeleton that is most essential and makes up the axis of our body. So it is the vertebrae, the rib cage, and the skull. And so those are going to be the three regions that we're going to focus on for today and really break down for today. Right? So skull, vertebral column, thoracic cage. And we'll go in that order for today. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about the skull, right? And our skull is not one bone. It is many, many bones, but we really break it up into two general regions here. When we look at our skull, we have the facial bones, right? These guys right here, and the cranial bones, these guys right here. Right? And so there's actually two parts that we're going to be looking at for today. Cranial and facial bones. And we're going to start with our cranial bones. Now, for our cranial bones, these are going to be the bones that make up the top portion of the skull. These are going to be primarily flat bones. Right? So if you take a look, these are going to be our thinner type of bone. And their major job is to protect the brain, as well as have some kind of outcroppings to allow for some muscle movement and attachment. Now, for our bones of the cranium, we have a couple. We have, first and foremost, our frontal bone. Frontal bone's probably the easiest to remember. It is just the bone dead center in the front of the forehead. Think forehead frontal. Right? So that frontal bone, right, makes up the front part of our skull. But what you'll see, if the camera's clear enough, is you can see that there's these lines that run between the bones that make up the skull. And you'll be able to see it a little bit better on an actual piece of skull here, right? And so you can see that there's these things called sutures. We talked about these a little bit when we were talking about development of a skull. And so our frontal bone is connected to, these are called the parietal bone, by the coronal suture. This suture that distinguishes the frontal bone, right? And so the frontal bone connects to our parietal bones by that suture. All right, so next up is our parietal bone. And when I think about the parietal bone, right, so if we take a look here, you've got frontal, then you've got the two parietals, and I always think the parietal is where your hair parts, right? So parietal, top of the skull, top of the head, two bones, one on each side. They are connected to the frontal bone by the coronal suture, and they are connected to each other. If you take a look, you can see this line down the middle. Well, they are connected to each other by the sagittal suture. So another suture that just connects the two parietal bones and makes up that top middle suture of the skull. We then have our temporal bones. Temporal bones, if you think, right, where your temples temples right on the side right here. Your temporal bone is going to be right there. So this is your temporal bone, right? It is this side section of your skull, right? It's kind of where your ears will sit. It's like right around here. And so think temples, temporal. Again, it'll just make up part of the skull. And you are going to see that the temporal bones, right? You have one on both sides. Temporal bones will be connected to the parietal bones by the squamous suture. Think squamous sutures on the side squamous, right? And so the squamous will connect the two bones of the side of the skull. The parietal, the top one, down to the temporal, the lower, the bottom one. Now, on our temporal bone, we have a couple of really important bone markings that we want to know and have a general idea about. And so, because the temporal is both on the side of the skull and the closest to where we have like sense organs, it tends to have really important functions for our body's ability to sense different things in our environment. And so, on our skull, we have a couple major markings. And the first is going to be the external auditory meatus. And if you take a look here, you'll see there's this ear hole, right? Ear hole. And I'll show you it on the real skeleton as well. You've got the ear hole. That ear hole is an ear hole, right? It is just a hole that allows for the tubes and the eardrum to actually sit into the skull while not being really easily damageable. And so because we need some things that connect outside to inside, we need tubes that actually go through the bone. And so the external auditory meatus, if you think auditory, think ears, it's actually the tube that allows for the eardrums to go into the skull. And that tube is going to be found on the temporal bone. So it's part of the skull, part of the cranium, but it's really like innervation into that. It's a hole in there. We also have what is called the mastoid process. This is probably the easiest one for you to feel, literally. It is this big bump on the back here. So when you feel your head, if you feel right on the back of your ear, you'll feel like a bone kind of push up on it. And that's the mastoid process. And it is just kind of a like divot down. It is a projection right down behind the ear. And it is really important for movement, right? Processes are typically the places where muscles will attach to a bone. And so your mastoid process is really important because as you move your head side to side, it's actually your mastoid process that's being pulled left and right. It's the muscle called the sternocleidomastoid that attaches from the mastoid process to the sternum, and when we contract it, it will pull our head to one side or the other. And so this is just a place where muscles will attach to the skull. We also have, and this one you don't super need to know, the styloid process. Styloid process, if you see at the bottom here, we have these two little dots, or these like little lines, these sticks that come up. These are really helpful for anchoring down muscles as well as anchoring down the tongue and throat. So they're important, but they're much smaller. They don't have a ton of strong muscles attached because they break really easily. And when we look at the actual skull, like the human skull, you can't see them because they tend to be one of the pieces that break first, just because they are so thin and so small. But those are also found on the temporal bone. Now, lastly, we have our occipital bone. Occipital bone is the one attached to the back of the skull. See how there's this suture right here that kind of rings over, and then we have this bone on the back, and that is the occipital bone. Occipital bone is connected to the other bones of the skull by the lambdoid suture. And so that connects the parietal bones, these part bones at the top, to the occipital back here by the lambdoid suture. On the real human skeleton, the occipital actually fell off. So this is where the lambdoid suture is, but we can't actually see the other piece of the skull. Now, we also have in our occipital lobe what is called the foramen magnum. If you remember, foramen is that word that just means hole. Magnum, large. Foramen magnum is the large opening that allows your spinal cord to leave and connect your brain to your body. And so remember, foramen, hole, foramen magnum is going to be on that occipital lobe. So those are our cranial bones and the major bone markings associated with them. We are now going to shift and transition to our major facial bones and really the bone markings that are important to that as well. And we start with our sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone is a really cool one that you wouldn't see traditionally because the sphenoid bone is actually this like sticking out bone that makes a bat at the front of the skull. So this is like where the frontal bone would be, and it is the floor of the skull, right? And it is this bat-shaped bone. It's an irregular bone. It helps make up the eye sockets, as well as making a base so that the brain can kind of sit on top of it. But that is going to be our first sphenoid bone. Then we have the ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone is a really, really small one. It's really hard to see because it makes up the inner portion. So if you see in the eye, there's like an inside, and then there's a deeper section of the eye. It is the deeper section of the eye. And then you can actually kind of see it into, in the skull here when we take a look. And so it's kind of this middle section that will then dip down into the inside of the eye socket. So it makes up, like, it's right near the sphenoid bone. It's right kind of on top of the sphenoid bone. Or actually it's underneath the sphenoid bone. And it allows and helps make up part of the eye socket and the nasal cavity. Again, irregular bone to allow for tubes and things to move through it. We then have the nasal bones. These are probably the easiest bones to remember. They are the bridge of the nose, right? It's just these two bones that sit right on the top of the nose. Super easy, right? Most of your nose is cartilage, that's why it's wiggly, but there is actual, bone up at the top, and that bone is our nasal bones. We also have our vomer. Vomer is one that is really easy to see in a like a fake skeleton, right? You can see this middle line right through the middle of the nose. That's the vomer. It helps make the nasal septum. Now, like the styloid process, this is also one of the pieces that goes quickest in real human bone, and so you actually can't see the vomer there anymore. It kind of broke out. But vomer is going to help to make that nasal cavity. We also have our maxilla. So when we look at the skull, specifically the facial bones, we have these two major bones associated with the mouth. We have this top one and this bottom one. And so this top one right here, this is our maxilla. It is our major upper mouth bone. It forms the upper jaw as well as making the hard palate, which is like your palate, the top bone here. And so what that does is it helps to form the jaw. And when we talk about the mandible, the one right below, the maxilla is basically the section that stays put as the jaw moves up and down. And it's almost like a stuck force that the jaw will crush into. So the maxilla is really, really strong and makes up a lot of our actual face here. We have right off of the maxilla here, we have what is called the zygomatic bone. So see where this maxilla kind of crops up and becomes like raised? Here, let's try and show it like that. Right, so see how it gets like raised up here? That is our zygomatic bone. It's your cheekbones. When you see people with like really defined cheekbones, like the Timothée Chalamet cheekbones, it's because they have really, really large zygomatic bones. They're basically sticking out more, meaning that you can see more of that cheek. And that piece rises up. And so this right here, that is our zygomatic bone. Really important for our cheekbones and eye sockets, right? Helps to make that those function. Now, off of our zygomatic bone, we have what is called the zygomatic process, right? So where there is a bone, if something sticks off the bone, it is going to be a process. And so if you look here, right, we've got our bone, and then it sticks up to here, and this is our zygomatic process, right? It is just a projection from the temporal bone, so from this guy right here, that connects to the cheekbone. And so where this bone, see how it's like disconnected? This disconnection is the zygomatic process. Really important for some muscle connection too, but we'll talk about that way later. Now we have the mandible. This is the lower section of the jaw. So, right, mandible is this guy. Mandible is the movable section of the jaw. It moves up to oppose the maxilla, to allow for chewing, talking, right, to allow those two to compress. And on the mandible, what you'll see, and this is going to be a really small one, so let's see. Do you see that little hole? That little hole is called the mental foramen. Remember that word, foramen just means hole, right? Mental foramen is basically a small hole that allows for nerves to run into the jaw. This is also why when we do like local anesthetic, it's so effective. It's because you're actually putting anesthesia into a nerve that runs through the jaw, and it runs into that bone through that mental foramen. So again, bone marking on it, just a way to send nerves and blood vessels into the jaw so that it can function. We also have in our eye socket what are called the lacrimal bones. So right in the inner eye here, right? Think about where you cry from. I believe in either Spanish or Portuguese, lacrima means to cry or tears. And so the lacrimal bones are the tear ducts. It's where those tears are going to come from, and it's right on the inside part of the eye, right? So the most inner part of the eye and the like closest towards the nose. So it'll be like right on this inside section here. And that is our lacrimal bones. And then our last one here is our palatine bones. If you've ever had like a palate expander, or you know what a palate is, the palate is the bottom section of your jaw, right? We have this upper part. This is where the maxilla is, right? So you can kind of see, like, as I'm holding it, this is all maxilla. But then as we go deeper to this bottom section here, which is called the hard palate, this is where we'll find those palatine bones. Just think palate, palatine. And these bones are helping to make the hard palate and the nasal cavity. And it's right above this palatine bone, right? If you've ever had like milk go up your nose, it's because it actually went through this gap right here, right? The palatine bones make up the hard palate and part of the nasal cavity. And so that's where it would actually flip to make something come out of your nose that you drank. All right, so those are our major bones of the skull, right? Of our cranium and our facial bones. Now we're going to jump into the vertebral column and the rib cage. And we're going to start with this vertebral column. So next up, we have our vertebral column. Now, the vertebral column is a large section of our body, of our torso, right? It makes up our entire torso. And the vertebral column is actually 24. You can really think about it as 26 if we include the sacrum and coccyx. But it is really just 24 individual bones that, when linked together, make one larger system or piece, right? The vertebral column is one of the most important and wildly inventive things that we have in our body, because what the vertebrae do is crazy. They hold in them the spinal cord, which is so wildly important to your body, to your functioning, right? It's what allows your body to send and receive signals. And so if it gets damaged, it's lights out, right? And we see it get damaged from time to time. And where it gets damaged when we're talking about spinal injuries is super important. If I break my spine or sever it up at the top, in the top region, I'm going to lose function of everything below what I break. If I break it in the bottom, I lose function of everything below. So these vertebrae are individual bones, but they have to fit perfectly to each other to actually function. And so while they're different bones, we're going to kind of classify them as slightly different sections of the vertebrae. And that's because while, yes, they're different bones, they all kind of resemble the same general thing and have the same general parts. And so for our regions, we're going to start up at the top with our cervical region. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. For our numbers, I'm going to give you kind of the rule. We have 7 of our cervical, the top vertebrae, 12 of our thoracic or the middle vertebrae, and then 5 of our lumbar or the lower vertebrae. The rule we kind of do for this is our breakfast, lunch, dinner rule. You eat breakfast at 7 a.m. You eat lunch at 12. You eat dinner at 5. I know those aren't perfect. Everyone has different lives, but it's a general way to remember how many vertebrae are making up each system. And when we look at the cervical vertebrae, the ones of the neck, we see thinner vertebrae, right? They tend to not be super large because we want to have a lot of movement in our neck, in our upper regions. And so they tend to be really thin. And we have 7 of them in this top section. Now, 2 of them are really important and specific. Our top vertebrae is called the atlas vertebrae. And its structure is very flat and kind of like a circle disc to like a stand almost. And that's because the atlas vertebrae is holding up the skull. Its job is to lock the skull in place to the vertebrae. And so it as a vertebrae doesn't necessarily do a lot other than to connect it so that it's easier for the rest of the vertebrae to lock in around the skull. So that atlas is our first and holds us in place. While the axis, the second vertebrae, is actually more of a spinner, right? The job of this axis is to act as a twisting or turning point of the spine. And so this is what allows us to move our head left and right? It's a pivot, and it's because the atlas sits and locks in while the axis moves around, facilitating that turning of the head. We then have 5 other cervical vertebrae below, right? All will have that same general small vertebrae structure. We then have our thoracic vertebrae. These are 12. They are in the middle. They're going to be slightly larger and have slightly bigger processes. So if you look on the back of a vertebrae, they have this guy, and we'll talk about the parts in just a second. But they'll have slightly larger ones of these than at the top. And again, it's to limit movement a little bit more, lock it more in place so that we are more stable in our core. We don't want to be able to spin, a ton. Because we could risk damaging that spinal cord. So the thoracic are the middle ones. And then we've got the lumbar at the base. We only have 5 of these. And these lumbar vertebrae tend to be significantly thicker in size. And this is because these are at the bottom of the spine. They're holding up more weight and therefore need to have more density, have more bone to be able to contradict or counteract the force of gravity affecting on them because they are lower. And so these tend to be thicker vertebrae. They don't go out so far as the thoracic ones. And these are really locking in place so that we have very little movement, so that we are as supported as possible. And then right below our lumbar vertebrae, we have what is called the sacrum. The sacrum is this piece right here. It's actually used to be vertebrae, but they are now fused, right? And so you can still see that there's these dots, these lines, because technically they were vertebrae, but they've fused together and now form part of our pelvis. And then right at the bottom, you'll see this guy. That's our coccyx or our tailbone. And it is a fragment or remnant. It is a vestigial part of our former tail, and now it acts as kind of a muscle attachment site. So there are some things that attach to it, but it really is just kind of a little bit that sticks off the end of the sacrum. Now for our vertebrae, I talked about them in general, but I want to break down the parts of the vertebrae so that we understand really what we're looking at here. And it's really important to understand so that we know why the spine isn't all the same exact vertebrae. And so in our vertebrae, we have a couple major features. We have first and foremost our vertebral body. This guy right here, this large circular section, this is the weight supporting section of our spinal cord. We then have our spinous process. Spinous process is the section of the vertebrae that sticks off the back, right? And so if we take a look at a couple vertebrae, you'll see spinous process, right, sticks out, spinous process sticks out. And when you combine these together, what you'll see is that the spinous process, right, these guys on the back, will basically lock in and will be what restricts us from going too far backwards or forwards. These basically restrict movement to some extent. And those are the spinous process. Think when you feel your spine, the bumps that you're feeling, those are all the spinous processes. We also have what is called the transverse processes, right? These are the side projections. These are really important because this is where ribs will actually connect around. So you won't be able to see it from here, but our vertebrae on the back of our skeleton connect directly to the ribs. So vertebrae to rib, vertebrae to rib, vertebrae to rib. It's consistent across the skeleton or across the vertebrae. And so those transverse basically allow for attachment of the ribs to complete that circle. And then we have our articular processes. Articular processes are a little bit tougher because there are two of them on almost every vertebrae. And what these are, so let's take two of these for example, right? We have two vertebrae right here. 1, 2. Now, for these two vertebrae to fit into each other, one has to slot into the other. Now, if we look at this bottom one, see how it has these like teeth sticking up? These guys right here, right? These two. These sticking teeth will connect. Do you see how this guy at the bottom has like a gap, almost like it has a slot or space for those teeth? And it's because it does, right? So as these two come together, the articular processes, so this is it's on the lower part for this one. So this is the inferior articular process, will connect to the superior articular process of the next one in the chain. Now, this one, it's inferior, right? Down here, it's inferior articular process will slot into the superior of the next one. And this will go on and on, right? It is these articular processes that allow one vertebrae to slot into the next. And so vertebrae will have one on the top, one on the bottom, except for obviously the lowest lumbar vertebrae and the atlas vertebrae. Okay? All right, now we're going to jump into our last section of these notes, and this will be the shortest section, focusing on our thoracic cage, right? Our rib cage. This part is super important, right? This is the cage that protects our heart, our lungs, right? Protects those hollow organs. These are all going to be flat bones here, or at least for the most part, they're all flat bones. And when we look at our rib cage, you'll see the blue, which is our cartilage. There's going to be a lot of cartilage on our rib cage, specifically in the attachment between the sternum to the ribs. It's because our inhalation, right, breathing, you need to be able to increase the size of the lungs, and that means that the rib cage has to be able to expand to some extent. So we need that cartilage attaching the ribs to the actual sternum. And so for our parts of the sternum first, right, we have our sternum here, and this is the bone that is going to protect our heart and the middle of our body, as well as act as an attachment for ribs. The body of the sternum, so if you see here, see how there is like this top section, this middle section, and then a bottom section. And you can kind of see that there's lines on it here. And those are also true of the real bones too. Now, the body of the sternum is this middle section right here, the long middle section. That is the body of the sternum. And that's where most of the ribs are going to attach to. We also have down at the base here, this guy called the xiphoid process. There's going to be some muscles that attach to here. It's just a little bit of like the bottom piece of the sternum. It's a little like piece of bone that sticks down. We have up at this is the top region here. This whole region is called the manubrium. So manubrium is this top bit. It makes up the joint at the first rib joint, and it creates a joint with the clavicle, right? So with the collarbone. So super, super important here. So manubrium is this guy. And then see how there's this little divot right here? That is the jugular notch. And it makes sense it's called the jugular notch. It's right at the top here. You can feel it pretty distinctly of your jugular. And that manubrium jugular notch allows for the collarbone to connect to the sternum to make it all kind of go around. So that is our sternum. Now we have our ribs. And in ribs, we have what are called true, false, and floating ribs. And so we'll start with these true ribs. And what it means to be a true rib is, if you see here, see how we have the sternum and then one piece of cartilage, right? That one piece of cartilage is going to connect directly to one intercostal, right? So to one rib. The next one in the chain will connect one to one. And so where our ribs connect from rib directly to sternum, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, these 7 are all called true ribs because they connect one rib directly to one piece of cartilage that connects directly to the sternum. While we then have our next 3 ribs, so rib 8, 9, and 10, that if you look, do you see how these guys, right, so 8, 9, 10, these guys are all connected to each other and then to the sternum. These are much less solidly connected, way easier to break, and these are called false ribs because, well, this is the cartilage still, but the ribs attached to them are called false ribs because they don't have that same one-to-one straight connected to the sternum that the true ribs do. And then our last ones here, if you take a look on the back here, you'll see that there's a couple ribs that are just entirely not connected to cartilage at all, the bottom 2. And those are our floating ribs, right? They're floating because they actually are floating, right? They're not connected to anything other than the vertebrae on the back. There's no connection to the front. And those are our final type of rib. That is it for today for our 4th lecture. Next class, we are going to be talking through the appendicular skeleton, right? Talking much more about the bones that make up our shoulders, hips, arms, and legs. And so have an amazing day.